Hi everyone, Dr. Ben Frimpong here again, and welcome to my YouTube channel, TutorMed, where everything medicine is simplified. In today's lecture, we want to talk about the hyperkalemia ECG changes, because this is a very common question tested in exam, and we want to provide a very simple way to remember it, and so stay tuned. Very good. And so one way to remember the ECG changes in hyperkalemia is to remember the statement that hyperkalemia affects everybody on the ECG. Hyperkalemia affects everybody on the ECG. And so as a quick recap, let's look at the components of the ECG, or the waves or the various complexes and segments that make up the ECG. And so this is an ECG strip, and this is a typical ECG tracing. And so what are the components? We have the P wave here, which represents atrial depolarization. Then we have the Q, R, S waves, which combine together to form the QRS complex. And then that represents ventricular depolarization. Then we have the T wave, which represents ventricular repolarization. Other components include the beginning of the P wave to the beginning of the Q wave. That is called the PR interval. And then the line which joins the T wave to the S wave, as indicated by this arrow, the ST segment. And so we want to see how hyperkalemia affects these components of the ECG. Always remember, hyperkalemia affects everybody on the ECG. Good, folks, and so let's begin. We are beginning with the P wave. How does hyperkalemia affect the P wave? You see, the P wave is either absent or flattened. And so kindly note that absent P waves do not always signify atrial fibrillation. Hyperkalemia can also do that. Then from the P wave, we move to the PR interval. How does hyperkalemia affect the PR interval? The PR interval is prolonged, and so please note that a prolonged PR interval does not always signify a heart block. Hyperkalemia can do that, and in fact hyperkalemia can cause a heart block. And so yes, so a PR interval which is prolonged can also manifest in hyperkalemia. Then from there we have the QRS complex. QRS complex. What do we say about the QRS complex? It is widened. It has a widened duration, or a widened x-axis. So the QRS complex is simply widened. And also the R wave in the complex appears short. Those are the changes in the QRS complex as far as hyperkalemia is concerned. The next after the QRS complex, as you saw, is the ST segment. What are the changes as far as hyperkalemia is concerned? Now you should note that for the ST segment, different schools of thoughts think that it may either be depressed, or elevated. And so you can have ST segment depression, ST segment elevation. All those are hyperkalemic changes. Then on the T wave, and I know this is what is commonly known to students, on the T wave, the T waves become tall and tented. So tall tented T waves are also a manifestation of hyperkalemia. Now in exam, when you are asked of the ECG changes in hyperkalemia, please be sure to mention a T wave changes first, the tall tented T waves, because that is invariably the first manifestation to see on the ECG whenever there is hyperkalemia. And also there is another waveform called the sine waveform. That is also a manifestation of hyperkalemia, and the next slide will show the various changes. Very good. And so on this slide, I want to show something I got from online, Geeky Medics. And so reference is made to Geeky Medics. I do not own this picture, so this is something I got from Geeky Medics, the various hyperkalemia changes. So I'm going to label them A, B, C, and D. And then as you can see the red arrow showing, These changes, vary with the level of hyperkalemia. For example, if you have a mild hyperkalemia as evidenced in A, you'll see that the first thing you will see is actually the tau tented T wave. Like I mentioned early on, whenever you are asked in exam to state the ECG findings of hyperkalemia, please be sure to mention the tau tented T waves first. Then you see that B is showing the short or the flattened P wave. Okay, the P wave is so flat. Then C shows the broad or the wide QRS complex, and typically the R wave is also short in amplitude. Then D shows the sine wave pattern. Just like I said, the sine wave pattern is also an ECG manifestation, and that signifies a very a relatively worse hyperkalemia. And of course, you have other arrhythmias that can be shown on the ECG, asystole and the like. And asystole means that the patient is clinically dead, because hyperkalemia can actually cause hyperkalemia-induced cardiac arrest. And so this is the end of our lecture today. I wanted to share. Thank you for watching. Please do not forget to like and share this video, subscribe to our channel, and let us know what you think in the comment section. And so see you in the next lecture. Until then, bye.